Welcome to Inside 340B Report, an insightful conversation between 340B Report's editorial team on the key issues affecting the 340B drug discount program, the nation's second largest government drug program. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Ted Slafsky, publisher and CEO of 340B Report, and I'm joined today by associate editors and senior writers Shannon Young and Will Newton, as well as our national correspondent, Bella Czajkowski. How is everyone doing? Shannon, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me, Ted.
Good. Will?
Yep, doing good. Looking forward to the show.
Excellent. And how are things in New York, Bella?
Things are good. Things are finally warm and spring-like here.
Good. Well, it's beautiful here in Washington, so it's a beautiful time to be in the city. So we'll get right to the interview in a few seconds. But first, I wanted to let our listeners know that we're pleased to offer a special discount to subscribe to 340B Report. First-time subscribers can receive a 25% discount. Go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use coupon code podcast25. I know you'll find our news service to be a valuable investment. With that, we're going to start discussing what's on the agenda for today's podcast. There's been actually a lot going on, including just today. This morning at 8:30 this morning, we had a news release and report that was unveiled by Senator Bill Cassidy, who's the chairman of the Senate Help Committee. This is a long-awaited investigation that he's been working on, and I know Shannon's been reporting on that, and she'll tell us more. But this is the culmination of a 2-year investigation into the 340B program, and I'll be interested in hearing Shannon's download. Then we're going to talk about President Trump's latest healthcare executive order, which actually has some provisions that would certainly impact the 340B provider community. So that will be interesting to learn about. And then finally, we're going to talk about how both providers and the drug industry are bracing for pharmaceutical tariffs. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with some key updates at the state level, where activity continues to be quite brisk. So I'll be looking forward to hearing what's going on in the States. So, Shannon, let's start by talking about the breaking news that came out of the Senate this morning.
Yeah, so as Ted said, we had some pretty big news. Bill Cassidy released his long-awaited report on his investigations into 340B. Now, anybody in the 340 space for the last few years has probably heard about these probes. He's been sending letters to just about every stakeholder that touches 340B, whether it's hospitals, health centers, drug makers, contract pharmacies. And they were kind of open-ended letters at the time that Cassidy sent them. He was the top Republican on the Help Committee under a Democratic leadership in the Senate. So the investigation didn't really have a lot of teeth, kind of unclear what would happen. But with Republicans winning control of the Senate, Cassidy now chairs the committee, which gives him more powers to enforce these sort of investigations. And so the fact that he waited until he was in the chairmanship position to release this report is definitely noteworthy. The report was almost 200 pages long. A lot of it was just sort of technical paperwork and back and forth on what happened as part of the investigation, but it included some key takeaways and findings, as well as some potential legislative recommendations that could signal how the Senate is going to approach 340B policy under this Republican leadership, at least how the Help Committee plans to address the issue. But, it also kind of remains to be seen. We have a bipartisan Senate group that is working on the Sustain Act, which is a wide-ranging 340B reform bill. That's been the product of having a bunch of different stakeholders to the table. We haven't seen a draft of this come out yet, but that is on the agenda for 2025 and something we're all awaiting. And we also have John Thune as the majority leader in the Senate, who has been a big proponent of the 340B program. He used to be part of the bipartisan Senate group. So, even though Cassidy has put out this report and these recommendations, it still remains to be seen how widely they're adopted or what kind of traction they gain in the Senate. And so I'm going to get into some of the key findings here. A lot of them were kind of as expected, I think, from people in this space, just based on how the investigation had been going, the way that questions were worded in these letters. But some of the takeaways are there was 2 hospital covered entities that were targeted in the probe, and they were found to have, quote, generated hundreds of millions of dollars in 340B revenue, but didn't pass discounts directly onto their patients. They differed on how their patients received 340B drug discounts and used savings on capital improvement projects and community benefit programs, but didn't say what specific 340B revenue goes to, what specific expenses 340B revenue goes to. For health center providers, they were found to have generated significant revenue from the 340B program, with few therapeutic drug classes accounting for a majority of this revenue. And they differed on how they utilize contract pharmacies and provide 340B drug discounts to patients. For large chain pharmacies who work as contract pharmacies, they were found to have charged covered entities a complex range of fees for using their pharmacy services to dispense 340B drugs, in addition to charging administrative fees for third-party administrator services. They found that the fees generally increase each year, divert resources from the 340B program's intended purpose of allowing covered entities to use federal resources to benefit as many patients as possible, and make it increasingly challenging for covered entities to deliver essential services and care to patients. And then for drug manufacturers, the report found that the drug makers had reported significantly increasing 340B sales to contract pharmacies compared to direct sales to hospitals and grantees. But their data shows that manufacturers' policies limiting the number of contract pharmacies that covered entities can use have not led to a meaningful decline in purchases of 340B drugs. Drug manufacturers have also claimed that they have difficulty taking actions that ensure 340B program integrity, such as preventing unlawful diversion to ineligible patients and duplicate discounts. Um, so those were some of the main takeaways there. And then it also included a handful of legislative changes. Of note, one is to examine legislative changes to the definition of eligible patient, which has been a big topic of discussion in a lot of the debate on these 340B bills in recent years. Other recommendations included requiring covered entities to report in detail annually on how 340B revenue is used to ensure direct savings for patients, addressing potential logistical challenges caused by increased administrative complexity, investigating TPA and contract pharmacies' financial benefits from administering the 340B program, and requiring transparency and data reporting for entities supporting 340B participants. And so, it's going to be interesting to see how these proposals pop up. Like I said, there's the Sustain Act, which is largely backed by the provider community, but we've also seen ASAP 340B, which is an alliance of Pharma, NAC, and a handful of other groups that has put forth the Access Act, which is a more controversial bill. And it's gained a lot of criticism from the provider community, is just sort of promoting the drug industry's interests. ASAP 340B really liked Cassidy's findings. They put out a statement saying that it backs up everything that they've been saying, and they're why the program needs to be reformed. So that's just an interesting little tidbit that came out this afternoon. But overall, responses have been pretty mixed, and it kind of fallen again along the lines that we expected. Providers, contract pharmacies have been more critical, saying that different data points in the report misrepresent the program, whereas the drug industry has, largely argued, yeah, this backs up everything we've been saying.
Yeah, that's interesting, Shannon. Yeah, we were all expecting that this report would eventually come out and would eventually be likely to criticize the 340B program, and also uh, underscore Senator Cassidy's interest as well as the drug industry's interest in changing the program. And I know there's a lot of concern among the providers that maybe this could be a precursor to a potential rebate model. Was there any reference to anything like that?
Not that I've really been able to dive into quite yet, but I do want to note that in a lot of responses from providers, they noted that Cassidy has not been a giant fan of the 340B program, and so I think there could be concern that his feelings sort of biased the investigation and this report. But there's just a lot in this report that I'm still digging into, so I can't comment specifically on the rebate model, but I do know that that has been a major concern for providers.
Yeah, I know there was criticism of the replenishment model, which is something that has been important part of the 340B program for many years, which allows for what is described as virtual inventory. Whether that would necessarily mean that we might have a program that would be changed from an upfront discount to a rebate model remains unclear, but certainly having that virtual replenishment model has been a central aspect of how the 340B program has worked for many years because there's just not enough room in pharmacies to have a 340B section and a non 340B section. So that would be really interesting to see where Senator Cassidy goes forward on this.
Yeah, and to your point, Ted, when Cassidy put out these letters to the drug makers in the fall, there was a lot of talk in the provider community about what this could signal and if it is a precursor for rebates. As you remember, at the time, J&J had just put out their proposal, and so Bella covered the letters to the drug makers back in the fall. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background on those conversations and what was included in those talks?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw the various rounds of letters come out to different stakeholders, of course, and folks in the 340B community were sort of comparing and looking at the various inquiries. So when Cassidy sent letters to drug makers Eli Lilly and Amgen last fall, provider advocates by and large told me that they thought the inquiries into the drug makers specifically were kind of softball compared to the other types of stakeholders in the program. And for the most part, they appeared to give those drug makers another platform to sort of document their concerns about alleged program abuses. Now, we've all seen the report about 2 years later after all of these inquiries, and it did echo many of the drug industry's concerns. Ted mentioned the replenishment model as one aspect. And the report called for an examination of contract pharmacies' use of the replenishment model, which could be important because drug makers, including Eli Lilly, are justifying controversial rebate models, which they've proposed and been met with resistance from the federal government and providers. But they're justifying those rebate models in part based on concerns over the replenishment model and hiccups there. So we'll definitely have to keep an eye out. Like I said, providers and the federal government have opposed those rebate models pretty strongly.
Thanks, Bella, for that. And Ted, I know we talked a little bit about the Sustain Act. I do want to note that in these responses, we haven't seen anything come out from this bipartisan group of lawmakers who are working on that legislation. So it's hard to say exactly where they're going to fall. But do you want to give us a little bit of context as to why they could play a huge role in what happens to 340B?
Sure, Shannon. As you mentioned, we have six bipartisan senators are crafting legislation called the Sustain 340B Act, which is expected to be much more friendly to the covered entity community. It will likely include contract pharmacy protections and give stronger enforcement authority to HRSA, along with some new transparency measures that will be supported by the drug industry. But it's largely considered, as you mentioned, a provider friendly legislation. The original six senators behind the effort were Republicans John Thune, Shelley Moore Capito, and Jerry Moran, and Democrats Debbie Stabenow, Tammy Baldwin, and Ben Cardin. They were expected to introduce their bill last August, but it got delayed due to some last minute uh, disagreements over the final language. We now have some new members of this bipartisan group of six. Senator Thune is very, very busy now as the majority leader, so he is no longer serving on this group of six, but I'm sure he will have significant influence on it. In March, Senators Mark Wayne Mullen, an Oklahoma Republican, and Democrats John Hickenlooper and Tim Kaine were announced as the newest members of the bipartisan working group, replacing Thune, as well as Stabenow and Cardin. Stabenow and Cardin have both retired from the Senate. We don't know exactly what's going to be in the final sustained 340B Act, but Capito mentioned at the NAC conference in February that they're dedicated to getting this done and that we'll have more updates soon. The fact that they announced the formation of new members to the formation of the group is a sign that they're very focused on this. And so I do expect there to be legislation introduced at some point in the coming months. They are a little distracted right now, as you all know, because they are trying to get a reconciliation bill done, which basically would extend the Trump tax cuts and do a number of other things, including potentially significant Medicaid reductions. So their 340B has not been at the forefront of the legislative agenda, at least not yet. For other issues that are not necessarily related to Congress, but are related to what's going on in Washington, maybe, Will, you could tell us a little bit more about President Trump's recent executive orders, specifically the ones that would impact the 340B provider community.
Absolutely. So, President Trump pretty recently issued a pretty far reaching executive order on drug pricing policy that essentially kind of revived a lot of the controversial policies that his administration had tried to implement during his first term. And it includes two specific provisions that'll have some pretty significant implications for 340B providers. So the first one is a rule that would instruct HHS to develop a rule that would require community health centers to charge certain low income patients the 340B price for insulin and EpiPen products. So that would essentially mean that health centers don't generate any 340B savings on insulin and EpiPens distributed to these particular patients. So this is pretty similar, essentially the same as a rule that the Trump administration put in place during his first term. That rule ultimately didn't take effect, though, because the Biden administration rescinded it shortly before it was set to take effect. But health centers expressed a lot of concerns with that rule and have also expressed some concerns with this revamped attempt at it and the latest executive order. They're basically arguing that health centers already have a lot of really strict rules in place about how they pass on savings to patients and use 340B savings to provide free or lower cost care. And so the way this rule is written would pose some administrative challenges and significant operational challenges that health centers feel would not really meaningfully add to patient drug access. So they've expressed some concerns there, and we're certainly expecting them to continue showing concern there. And then the second really important provision of this executive order as it pertains to 340B providers is related to Medicare payment. So the order directs HHS to conduct a survey on hospitals' drug acquisition costs for outpatient drugs and how those costs compare to Medicare payments for those drugs. So this survey, although the executive order itself doesn't specifically mention 340B, is very widely viewed as a precursor for the Trump administration cutting Medicare payments to 340B hospitals. So, notably, the Trump administration did actually pretty significantly cut Medicare payments to 340B hospitals during his first term, but the Supreme Court ruled that those cuts were illegal in a 9-0 decision. It's worth noting, though, that that decision was largely along procedural grounds, including the fact that the Trump administration didn't conduct the required survey beforehand. So this time around, the Trump administration is conducting that survey, and all signs indicate that, President Trump is once again looking to make these Medicare payment cuts to 340B hospitals, but on stronger legal footing this time around. So hospitals that we've spoken to have pretty strongly opposed these cuts. They say that any payment cuts to them that affect their 340B savings and overall bottom line would significantly hurt their ability to continue to provide lower cost services to vulnerable patients and keep their doors open. And so they are certainly very concerned about what these types of cuts would mean. So these two impacts of the executive order, on top of everything else we followed in Congress, are really important things that we'll be covering here and that the 340B provider community should be aware of right now. And with that, I know we've talked a lot already. We'll take a quick break to hear from one of our amazing sponsors before getting back to you to talk a little bit more about tariffs and some state 340B legislative activity.
Pillar Health sets the standard in 340B with innovative solutions that empower organizations and drive operational success. With a foundation of integrity, exceptional service, and relentless innovation, Pillar Health takes the complexity out of managing your 340B program. Focus on what matters most, serving your community, and let Pillar Health handle the rest. Find out more at pillarhealth.com.
As stakeholders across the 340B community prepare for the impact of the executive order and potential major 340B legislation in Congress, they're also bracing for the impact of broad tariffs that may be placed on the pharmaceutical industry that the Trump administration is considering implementing. Bella, can you tell us about what to expect?
Yeah, Ted. So the Trump administration recently launched an investigation into whether importing drugs poses a national security risk. This appears to be the first step in the administration placing broad tariffs on pharmaceutical products and ingredients, which at first floated as an idea in mid-February. It's important to note that pharmaceuticals have historically been exempt from tariffs since they fall pretty firmly into the needs category as opposed to the wants category of goods. But this investigation is expected to sort of lay the groundwork for justifying these tariffs on pharmaceuticals and how it could be harmful that much of the manufacturing and ingredients comes from abroad. There's still no definitive start date for the tariffs, but U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said mid-April that these tariffs will be implemented in, quote, the next month or two. There's a lot of speculation around when they'll take effect, but there's actually even more speculation about or question around what they entail so far as size and scope are concerned. We've talked to a number of provider advocates and drug makers in recent weeks, and 340B providers have warned that tariffs could destabilize 340B prices in the short term, cause a lot of volatility there, and worsen drug shortages, especially among generic drugs, which already have a very thin profit margin. The drug industry also shares concerns, and drug makers that mainly manufacture in the U.S. already aren't necessarily immune from or less vulnerable to the tariffs because many of them rely on ingredients, including the active ingredient in drugs, which can be the most expensive from abroad. India exports a lot of those ingredients. We've seen in recent weeks several large drug companies have announced tens of billions of dollars in investments in U.S. manufacturing, and this money will go towards opening new plants and hiring thousands of workers, both to build those factories and then employing them within the various drug companies. So overall, the impression I've gotten across the board from 340B stakeholders is that these proposed tariffs are adding sort of just another layer of uncertainty to the 340B landscape.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see whether those tariffs ever get implemented. I'm a little skeptical that there are going to be many tariffs against the drug industry. Um, Another interesting point is, as Bella, you mentioned, this is one of those rare issues where the 340B provider community and the drug industry are aligned. I think they all agree that tariffs are a tax and are a mistake. I think everyone agrees with President Trump's desire to make more investments in the U.S. On these issues, but it's a question of implementation and a question of practicality. As I think you mentioned in one of your articles, Bella, it takes many years to get these plants up and going. And what are you going to do for the next 4 or 5 years? And I'm also a little skeptical that some of these announcements by the large pharmaceutical manufacturers will actually come to fruition. Isn't that an issue that it does? You can't just turn on a switch.
Yeah, yeah. So some of the provider advocates I spoke with, they mentioned, yeah, anywhere estimates from anywhere from 3 to 5 years to 5 to 8 years to sort of build up the manufacturing capabilities here in the U.S. But also, there's an issue of labor. China and India have massive, massive labor forces that can sort of facilitate this manufacturing in addition to the plants. So it'd be hard to onshore all of the production. But it seems that since the tariffs have been announced, like I mentioned, these drug makers have announced additional investments. We'll see whether those have an impact and deter the tariffs.
That's interesting. Thank you, Bella. Appreciate your good reporting there. Now, I think it'd be good time to move on from federal developments to federal and international developments, actually, to more at the state level. Will, I know you were keeping a close eye on various state capitals. What have we seen in the last 10 days or so?
Yep. So, in addition to everything happening in the 340B world on the national and international scene, there has always been a lot happening at the state level. And so, with a little bit of time left, I think I want to focus on two particular bills that I've been covering recently. So, the first one is in Indiana, and the state House and Senate there had been negotiating on a bill that would require 340B providers to annually report detailed financial and operational information about their 340B programs. So, the compromise that the two chambers ultimately reached was that those requirements would apply only to 340B hospitals, and both chambers nearly unanimously passed that compromise bill. So it's headed to the governor's desk. The governor, Mike Braun, a former U.S. senator who's been at many times an outspoken critic of the 340B program and thinks there should be more oversight there. It's headed to his desk. He's widely expected to sign that. So, in all likelihood, Indiana is on the cusp of becoming the fifth state to have some form of a 340B provider reporting law. So, hospitals and pharmacists in Indiana have said that they support transparency and want to work with the state legislature to comply. They have expressed some concerns that some of the actual things that the bill is requiring them to report would be pretty infeasible in terms of actually getting that information and also pose significant burden. But they, have expressed willingness to continue the dialogue with legislatures there. So that'll be something certainly that's interesting to follow.
There was an even more draconian bill that was introduced that related to reporting and billing. What happened to that?
Yeah, so in Indiana, the state legislature has been very focused on legislation that they believe would rein in hospital costs in the state. So the reporting bill is the one that's ultimately most likely to become law. But lawmakers at one point, as part of a much larger healthcare bill, were considering a provision that would have restricted most hospitals from generating savings from the 340B program, which would essentially eliminate most hospitals' abilities to have a 340B program. So that language was ultimately amended out of that bill. That big healthcare bill is moving forward without that provision in it anymore. and the reporting bill is what's going to come out of Indiana. But to your point, it certainly speaks to the fact that in Indiana, there certainly has been a ton of momentum behind doing something related to hospitals this legislative session.
And I think, as you pointed out in your reporting, Will, Indiana is the worldwide headquarters of the small little company called Eli Lilly. And so I know they're very influential. And my understanding is that the insurance industry also has a huge presence in Indiana. So I'm feeling a little sympathy, maybe a lot of sympathy to the providers in Indiana right now. It's certainly not a state that's particularly warm and friendly towards the program.
Yeah, definitely. And then the final state bill that I'll talk about is one in Tennessee. So the Tennessee House and Senate recently passed by pretty large margins a 340B contract pharmacy access bill and sent it to the governor's desk. But shortly before the House and Senate passed the bill, it was amended to basically grandfather in all existing contract pharmacy restrictions. So, under the law right now, any new drug maker restrictions on contract pharmacies put in place after July 1st of this year, when the law would take effect, would be prohibited, but all of the current ones would be allowed to stay. And, there are close to 40 different manufacturers at this point that do have restrictions in place. So, providers had to, from what they've said, make this compromise in order to get the bill forward, but that certainly will affect its, how much of an effect it has, and that definitely narrows its scope to some extent. Another pretty unique thing about this bill is that it also contains a quote winners only model for contract pharmacy arrangements, which essentially means that if a covered entity is contracting with a pharmacy, that only the claims that would generate profit or savings for the 340B covered entity would be processed as 340B claims, while any claims that result in a net loss for the covered entity would then instead be processed as retail claims. So normally without the winners only model, you're entering into a contract pharmacy arrangement, and you're getting the aggregate of all of the positive and negative claims. And if you're entering the agreement, presumably the positive claims outweigh the negative claims. But in this model, you only are responsible and are only getting the positive claims. So that's something that certainly providers in that state are excited about. And with that, I know we've been on a really long podcast. I'll turn it over to Ted to close us out.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the pharmacies in the state of Tennessee react to this winners only model. They may not think it's such a great idea, but nonetheless, an interesting compromise that occurred in the state of Tennessee. So that's a lot that we discussed today. Before we do wrap up, I do want to tell you about our exciting new podcast called 340B 360. I know you guys have been listening to Inside 340B Report and enjoying the conversations between our reporters and editors. And now we have a additional podcast hosted by Anna Mangum, who I used to work with at 340B Health. Many of you in the 340B community may remember Anna. The 340B 360 will feature interviews with the leading voices in the 340B industry. The first episode was released on Monday, and subsequent shows will be released once a month. I encourage you to check out 340B 360 wherever you get your podcasts, or go to the 340B Report homepage. It's a great podcast, and I think you're going to really enjoy listening to these conversations with our leaders from the various companies that are sponsors of our important publication. With that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and a special thanks, as I mentioned, to our amazing sponsors. Please be sure to follow along at 340B Report and keep an eye out for our next Inside 340B Report podcast, which will likely be in 2 weeks from today. Thank you.